Welcome to Dirty Tap Water. We are two therapists. Most importantly, we're two friends. And we're here to open the dirty tap. We're here to let the ideas flow. I'm glad you're with us. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, welcome. So, where should we get started, Mikey?
Where should we get started? Well, I know you had been talking a little bit about you've been talking about trust and vulnerability before we got on the call, and I really liked what you were saying. We were talking about we were talking about it in the context of prayer and what it means to trust God. And you said something really interesting. You said, I think trust with God means to bring your lack of trust to him.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Speak to that a little more.
Yeah, I think the context of this is growing up in a pretty devout Roman Catholic culture, and especially like a subculture here in Steubenville and at Franciscan. And feeling like I think I grew up feeling a tension between like a real reverence for the importance of spirituality and also like a frustration for the ways that spiritual platitudes were thrown around, and for ways in which, maybe like I was hurting, and the kind of spiritual tomes or things that were thrown at me, it was like, that doesn't fucking work. And one of these things that I heard so often, and then I think people just get told a lot, is like, you just got to trust God. And I was work with someone recently, and we were talking about this, and they were kind of saying, yeah, that's true. Like, how could you argue with that? How can you argue with like trust God? And then I kind of said in response, like, yeah, but like, what the hell does it mean?
Is this a client of yours?
And so one of the things that I was thinking about in therapy is that trust to me in therapy means like a willingness to share discomfort and a willingness to share fear. And I was praying the other day with reflecting on Thomas Merton. I'm doing this kind of daily reflection on Merton's writings through Lent. And it was asking about, let's talk about how fear is an obstacle to a relationship with God. And that made my skin crawl. I really didn't like it, because it felt like it was painting this picture that you have to push fear away in order to step into a relationship with God. And that just does not match my spirituality and my experience of prayer. I think most of my experiences of prayer are probably like telling God, like, I don't really trust you. And that's really scary. And so in therapy, what I've realized is that the most powerful thing, and I think we were kind of talking about this last week too, or on our last episode, that opening up doesn't have to be opening up about all this like explicit information, like all these stories or all these like experiences that have happening to us. Like, there's a real experiential vulnerability that can happen when we allow ourselves to be in the moment, connected with things that we're uncertain about. And so I was writing, and I kind of just like came to this sense of, I don't think trusting God is about banishing all mistrust. I don't think trusting God is about pushing away the parts of us that don't trust him. I think what real trust is, and I think this is in human relationships and in eternal relationships, I think what real trust is the ability to go before someone and say, I kind of have a problem with you. I think real trust is being able to go before someone and say, like, this relationship is really hard for me right now in this way. And the reason that I think that that is real trust, so real trust is actually saying like, hey, I'm having a hard time trusting you, is because that can only exist in a context where you think there's some chance that that will be received. Like, that's trust. And so yeah, I think I get frustrated with the church and a lot of religious leaders, because I think it's like, oh, trust God more, or pray more. But it's like, how the hell do you do these things? And what do you mean by them? And so I think that was a time where it felt kind of like a eureka moment, connecting like some of the ways I approach trust in therapy with the way that I approach trust with God, of being like, it actually feels way more powerful. I'm actually way more connected spiritually when I go before God in prayer. And I'm like, dude, I don't know if you're there. And that's really scary to me. And I'm even afraid of admitting that. And then sitting with that, I've just found it to be, it's helped me to connect way more with myself. It's helped me to connect way more with the ambiguities and the absurdness of reality. And I think it's actually created what feels like something of a relationship, rather than just talking to a wall. So yeah, that's been kind of some of the stuff that's been on my mind there.
So you're making this awesome distinction between vulnerability of content, vulnerability of process, and in therapy we're always talking about process, which is what's happening right now between you and I, not what am I telling you about. That's the content. The process is how are we interacting with each other. And there seems to be a notion that to be vulnerable is to share something that's hard, to share something that's uncomfortable with somebody, or to share something that is uncomfortable for you. And something that I was telling you before the show, when we just check in before we start recording, was it's been so healing for me in my own life, and also with the clients that I work with, to establish the boundary between two people who are having an intimate conversation. So as a therapist, when I'm talking to my clients and they're sharing with me, sometimes I'll notice that they'll start to kind of like feel overwhelmed. And sometimes just establishing that boundary of, I want to make it clear that if you have something that shows up inside of you, you don't have to share it with me until you feel ready, or until you feel safe, or ever. That's your freedom. That's your prerogative. But that seems like that runs against us another kind of trust that is pretty culturally present right now, which is, you tell me things that are hard to talk about, and
Yes.
you're kind of saying something a little different, not
Yeah.
opposing to it, but a little different, which is, yeah, it's good to be honest about the content at times, but sometimes it's actually more vulnerable and more of a real relationship to share with somebody what's hard about the interaction right now, what's challenging about it
Yes.
right now. Why is that fruitful for you? To talk to me about that.
It's the most important thing to talk about. I mean, because everything else that we talk about will be funneled through that interpretation. It will be funneled through those emotions. It'll be funneled through that, the way the interaction is feeling, like the experience that I'm having in the interaction, is one of the most important things that we can talk about, because our interaction is going to be interpreted through that emotional framework. And what's, I think, the most important is that we want like the content, the thing that we're talking about, to match like the process, the thing that we're doing. When those get mismatched, I think there's a problem. And I think like in prayer, this looks like, if I go to prayer and I kind of list this laundry list, or I say these things, and really there's a huge part of me that's just feeling like, I don't know if there's anybody there. This feels silly. this feels childish. This feels archaic and mythological. This feels tribal. This feels like I'm trying to speak to something that I hope is there because it would give my life meaning and purpose and clarity. I neither want to be dominated by those feelings to say, yeah, I'm just not going to pray. Because for one thing, I can tell you my life is better when I pray, period. You know, I neither want to be dominated by those feelings and totally avoid that relationship. But nor do I want to push those feelings so far away that I'm not connected with them, because then everything's going to be interpreted with some twinge of that. And so if I can, when in those moments when I'm feeling afraid in the relationship, if I can say, hey, I'm feeling a little scared here, it brings immediacy, it brings power, it brings connection. It's meaningful because it's an authentic experience through which we are meaning what we're saying and we're saying what we're meaning. And there is a integration between what's being experienced internally, between what's being expressed in the relationship, experienced in the relationship, and between what's being like expressed. And then it actually gives us the opportunity to talk about what's actually happening, you know, because you might be having a very different experience of it than I might be having. And that can really help clarify a lot of misunderstandings.
It seems like there's those two kind of lines in the sand, right? And I don't want to pretend that they're totally like exclusive from each other, but there's a you're talking about something that's so rare.
Yeah.
And I know for you and me, we kind of picked it up as we were learning therapy, but also a very particular kind of brand of therapy, the interpersonal psychotherapy, which is all about the relationship between the client and the therapist. Any kind of gestalt or therapy that really focuses on the present moment as the most important thing, the dynamic between two people as the most important thing. I think for me, my experience is that can feel very jarring at times. You know, as a therapist, it's sort of expected with my clients that we can go there to some degree, or at least they're open to the idea or the concept that environment is different. It's sort of they're aware of it before going in. But how does this work for you in your personal life? Because I find that it's such a foreign way of communicating. What does that look like?
Woof. Yeah, I think I'm still figuring that out. It's a great question, man. I'm really not sure. I think that it's a real call to authenticity. I think, and one of the biggest ways I think it shows up in my personal life is that I really am trying to become more aware of when I'm acting out of a place of defensiveness and fear, and when I'm allowing myself to really kind of fully show up. Yeah, one of the biggest ways I can kind of protect myself is to slip into this like me versus you mentality, and then try to figure out like all the ways that I'm right and why other people are wrong. Like when I feel unsafe, when I feel scared, when I feel threatened, I enact a process the process that I typically enact is what could be said is a process where which I'm going to try to make you feel small, and I'm going to make myself try to feel big, because that will give me a stronghold to escape this feeling of ambiguity that I'm in right now. But that's a really good. Yeah. What are your thoughts? Like, as you asked that question, what's happening for you?
I think in my own personal life, as I work in therapy with my clients, and I also try to work on my own stuff intermittently with a therapist, sometimes with a spiritual director. There's a feeling that I would like to do this more. I'd like to be
Yeah.
more capable. Part of it is I just don't always feel like I'm skilled enough to do it well. It's such
Yeah.
a different way of operating. Yeah, it's it's something I really want more of. Like I aspire for it in my life to have more of an authentic connection. And then there's also this balancing point, for inside of me where I recognize that not every relationship needs to be even that, right? Doesn't need to be
Yeah.
that level of vulnerability of process, right? It can be more of a content based relationship. Um, and also like that balance of respecting other people's threshold for, I know there's seasons in my life where I'm, maybe experiencing more stress. Even now, recently, I've just been under
Yeah.
a lot of stuff to worry about and take care of. That I know that in those stressful moments, I don't always want the same amount of vulnerability. I don't always,
Mm.
with everybody, right? I want it with very select people. And so as you're talking, I guess I'm just sort of in my head realizing just how nuanced it is to be a person, how hard it is, how
Yeah.
complicated it can be or it can feel sometimes. And what's so odd about that is that it seems like being real and vulnerable is the most natural thing we can do. It doesn't take effort, right? We don't need to try to attach. We just notice we get better at seeing ourselves resist attachment. But attachment with other people and vulnerability is one of the most intuitive and natural things we can do. And so, something I've been thinking a lot about is like, what is the go ahead, something seemed to come out of you.
Yeah, man. I want to
Another
ask you
thought.
about that because it doesn't feel intuitive to me. It feels like it takes a lot of effort. Like you're saying that like connecting and attaching is one of the most intuitive things that we can do. Um, how do you mean?
I think whenever my defenses are laid bare, and better way of saying it, whenever I feel safe, I don't have to think about how to express myself authentically, right? I don't have to think about how to
Hmm.
be. It's when I start to feel unsafe in a relationship or unsafe in a moment where I start to it starts to get complicated because little parts start to get withheld. And we say, well, maybe I shouldn't say this, or maybe I shouldn't
Yeah.
say this. And that's where it starts to get confusing. But in the moments where there's just a groundwork of you're safe, you're allowed to say what you want to say or what you need to say to me, what's real, there's usually like a softening um, that doesn't, it feels like suddenly I can just witness a process happening.
Yeah.
Whereas otherwise it feels very heady and sometimes like how do I manage this? Maybe more of like a management of a moment. Um, I think that's what I mean is that when I'm in a space where it's two healthy people, who respect each other, and there's a mutual desire to be close,
Yeah.
even the negative emotions or the negative reactions that emerge, they can be painful, right? Like attachment can, if we are honest and real with somebody, can bring up their honest and real reactions to us. But I
Mm-hmm.
find, like, for example, recently I was just having a conversation um, with someone very close, and I was being really vulnerable about like things that involved uncomfortable aspects of our relationship together. And that brought out in her like uncomfortable parts of the relationship for her.
Yeah.
But at the end of the conversation, like once we got into this groove, it just felt like, even though this is hard, this is so good. And I actually feel so much more
Yeah.
connected to you. There was a level of honesty
Yes.
and genuineness that
Yeah.
suddenly felt, I'll just say it felt more effortless than trying to
Yeah.
manage all of the like, how do I say this the right way? Or, if when two
Yeah.
people can own their subjective experience skillfully, I guess it does just sort of feel like, okay, my job here is not to be right or to be wrong. It's just to say,
Uh,
here's what I'm experiencing, just as it is. And there's a sort of directness to that.
that's really interesting because it's pretty different from my experience. I think that last part I think matches up in my experience, but um, I think I'm pretty much always in that place of like feeling pretty scared to share. Like I think I'm like, for me, and I think this is why this idea of trust is so important for me. I think this probably speaks to my attachment style too, is I'm perpetually in this place in relationships of like, can this person receive me? If I tell this person what I'm really thinking and really feeling, am I going to get rejected? Am I going to
Mm-hmm.
get am I going to make things worse? If I really told this person what I thought and felt right now, would they want to hold that? Could they hold that?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a trust is a really painful thing. And I think here you're kind of talking about what happens once we get over that. When we take the chance of trust and that turns out well for us, it does open up this area of effortlessness, of safety, right? Because they've
Mm-hmm.
kind of like passed the check. But it's always a risk. And it brings up something else on my mind, which is I think there's a real difference between trusting the relationship and trusting a person. Um, I think it's actually
Mm.
probably, I think it's more important for us to trust a relationship than it is to trust an individual person. Um, because a relationship is something that there's a shared responsibility for. And I think that's what I feel connected to you as you're saying
Mm.
the effortlessness, because you're talking about a relationship in which there's mutual accountability to self for subjective experience. And there's a relationship where there's a shared culture where it's normal and acceptable and good for us to reverence each other's subjective experiences, even in the ways that they differ, and then kind of come to a deeper understanding. But man, I'm always scared shitless to feel emotion in other people. Like it's it rarely feels effortless for me, and I think a big part of that is because a lot of shame that I hold, um, my own shame that I've inherited, you know, cultural shame in feeling emotion and feeling vulnerability. But it kind of pricked me. It kind of stuck out when you were like this effortlessness of
Mm-hmm.
attachment. I was like, wait, what? What are you talking about, Mike? Like attachment doesn't feel effortless. Um, I think there's a part of me that wants to be like, yeah, that's totally how it should be.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Um, you know,
Gosh, isn't that like I really resonate with what you're saying. To me, it sounds like what I'm saying is that there are moments where it feels like now now we can just say what we need to say, and that there's something about that feels effortless. But
now
most of
I'm
the time,
safe.
but getting to that safe place is usually a bumpy ride.
It's
and
terrifying.
and even with the most trusting people, I mean, even with the people we trust the most, even with a therapist, with I'm sure with my clients, as we kind of like bump into their more the more emotionally charged parts of them, it's hard. It's always hard. um yeah, it really struck me saying that this is the way it should be. And um so interesting. It seems to be like that reveals like a little bit of your worldview, you know
Hmm.
like in that there's some kind of we were made to connect. Or in all of our worldviews, I'm reading I'm listening to a little bit of Richard Rohr's The Wisdom Cycle and really liking it. And he kind of breaks down your worldview operates as your uh what what is the world, or what's wrong with the world, how did we get here, and how do we fix it. It's like that's your
Hmm.
fundamental sort of game plan. And it seems like somewhere in there, I wonder if it feels like there's a sense in which it's we were made to connect, right?
Yes.
That's the way out.
Yeah.
That's the way out of whatever suffering we're all in, is genuine, authentic, real connection.
Yeah. I do. I think that's what's wrong with the world. I think disintegration, right? Disconnection, um, interiorly, exteriorly, in relationships, and 100%. That's my worldview. Is that
Mm-hmm.
like fundamentally, that's kind of the core issue here, is that we're disconnected. And then we inherit, though we're made for connection, we inherit templates of disconnection, interiorly, exteriorly, or so. Yeah, I'm curious what the answer for those three questions is for you, Mikey.
I was just yesterday. I was kind of reflecting on it a little bit, and it's a smorgasbord. If I'm being honest, I mean it's um, there's probably like a lot of the capitalist worldview in there. Of
Yeah.
um, I don't think that kind of represents my like being, but it's sort of the practical side of me that's like, you've got to produce something to survive. In our world is very much a productivity focused space, and I personally feel that in my system. I think I feel a lot
Yeah.
of like um, and I think that's good. Like there's a degree of that is there's a strong sense of work ethic and a willingness to sort of put out meaningful things into the world as
Hmm.
much as possible. Um, but as far as like worldview goes, uh, I like to think that there's a lot of that connection based worldview as well. I think I
Yeah.
feel also to some degree, call it what I don't know what you would call it, maybe like the postmodern worldview of um, we're all so different, and part of what is wrong with the world is that when we're not allowed to express ourselves
Yeah.
as ourselves authentically, um, because of whatever it is that holds us back from expressing ourselves genuinely and authentically. One way out is
Yeah.
to come up with greater courage to be who you are, maybe more like an existential kind of worldview. Um, and I think too, like there's, I grew up in a Roman Catholic household as well, and still, that's probably one of the most fundamental things in my brainstem is uh, like human beings were made to give themselves away, right? And I think that those are two worldviews that I think experience a relative amount of tension. The one that inside of
Yeah.
me sees part of the solution as we do need to become who we are and express ourselves as we
Yeah.
really are. Like not figure out, but to risk genuine authenticity. Um, that exploration seems to sometimes run headfirst into uh, what would maybe be seen more as like the fundamentals of a Christian worldview, and this of love, of giving yourself away, of um, self gift, right? Not that they are exclusive, but it just reminds me of this tension that probably lives in all of us. I know it lives in me, of the tension of wanting connection, um, and the tension of like one of authenticity, of this is who I am. And as I'm saying that out loud, there on paper shouldn't be any disconnect. In fact, they should go together. Like the more authentic I am, I should be allowed to connect with people more when I'm my authentic self. But they feel inside of me, for whatever reason, like they don't always go hand in hand. In fact, like they rarely go hand in hand.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which like maybe to connect with another person sometimes means to not express all of those things.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes I wonder, like, how sad would it be if that was everybody's experience, where everybody wanted more authenticity and everybody was holding back some degree of it.
Oh, I
And
think it is, man. I think that's I at least my experience, and I think that's where we're in.
yeah, well, that is sad. That's really sad. And it also, like, when you say it, it just sort of makes me think there's got to be an easy way out, right? If everybody wants it,
Mm,
and nobody's, and well, I'm
yeah.
not saying nobody. There's, even with you, I feel like we have a very just genuine and authentic connection,
Yeah.
and people have that all over with
Yeah.
very select people. Um, but it's yeah, I think that's part of it for me. Is I think that I'm happiest when that those two are coming together. I'm being totally myself, and there's
Hmm.
connection
Yeah.
with another person. Um,
Yeah. They are. I mean, and Dr. John Crosby and the personalism of JP2 taught me this. Um, he calls them the polarities of the person, like togetherness and individuality, and kind of talked about that a few times ago on differentiation. But I do think they're polarities. I do think that they're. I don't think that they are. They're complementary, but things which at their height can be complementary often have extreme places of potential clashing all throughout the system. And I'm thinking of, Aristotle says that which is first in intention is last in execution. The first thing that you want to do, the thing that you set out to do, the thing that you set out to accomplish is the last thing that you actually do. And so when like you're talking about this worldview of both a desire to connect and to be close, but also a desire to be my own individual person and to be different. And you talked about this too. There's kind of different seasons, but there has to be some work and negotiation on both sides of that. I think that is the task of family life, is to help us to develop into that. And that's what Murray Bowen said. I think that's a really powerful idea. But it really is I think a core human predicament. I mean, we see this in our culture in the West, which is very individualistic, and then the culture in the East, which is more communal and collective. And the reality is that we need to be able to hold both rather than polarizing towards one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the integration is really, really hard because there's so many areas of parent contradiction, right? And I think if you jump, this is, I guess, what you were speaking to too, is some of my frustration with what can happen when you have a religion that's very old, 2,000 years old. And so what we get is these like high points. Oh, you find yourself fully when you're the greatest gift of self. And we hear that, and then we're like, oh, so I got to just give myself away. And then we're like, dude, I'm freaking bleeding out everywhere because I've just been giving, and I don't have anything left in the tank. And then we can be like, okay, I'm just going to take care of myself and kind of go off into a hole. And I think that's some of kind of what I was speaking to, the frustration that I feel so often with the platitudes, is that we can hear these insights that might be true, but that doesn't mean that they're very helpful prescriptively in telling us what we need to do. And I think I see, our work as therapists and working also as a teacher, as an educator, as like a role is to actually help people experience those truths personally in a way that helps guide their life rather than intellectually, because we can't live the fullness of life like up here. We have to be an experience.
The ideals. Are you saying
Yeah.
that striving for the ideals doesn't always lead to the best launch point? Even if they're great ideals, they're not the greatest. Even if they're descriptive, they're not always the best prescriptions.
Yes. Yeah, man. The ideals. We can't live an ideal.
I'm just thinking of someone who knows that like the ideal of health is to, hit certain baselines. And rather than starting
Yeah.
where they are, if they see, this is my squat number I'm supposed to hit, and this is how fast
Yeah.
I should be able to run a mile. And they just go out and they just try to run a mile that fast, or they try to
Yeah.
lift that much. You're gonna get
Yeah.
hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Exactly. Do you? So I have this hunch based on talking to people for a living, and not just talking to people,
Vague
but
hunch.
spending time in their inner worlds, that our culture is much more in its head than it is in its body.
Yes.
And I think that it's maybe you could say it's the West. I don't know. I mean, I haven't done much therapy with people in the East. I've had a few clients who come from those cultures. But it seems like, so as a therapist, our job is to sort of learn to perceive potential lacks of balance. And so we're always trying to, on some degree, maybe this is more of like a psychoanalytic approach, to restore balance in some way.
Yeah.
And so if there's an excess of thinking, it's providing a space for more feeling. And if there's an excess of feeling, providing something that allows for a greater sense of like a capacity to parent yourself and not be totally, controlled by your emotions. There's these sort of, I'm speaking very, very crassly about it, but it seems like in general, the therapist instinct in me is to invite people patiently, slowly, at their own, just, on their own timetable, into more feeling states and away from abstraction. Again, what I'm learning as a therapist is to start, though, with honoring the thinking mind if it's very strong in a
Yeah.
person. And actually, something that I'm finding very helpful is if somebody is trying to get in touch with feeling, to try to just bypass the mind is just going to create a whole level of like internal tension that won't get you there as fast. You know, one thing
Mm-hmm.
that's really helpful is saying, what if we use your mind to get closer to the emotions? And
Mm-hmm.
I'll give them like, we'll start working through a few books that allow their mind to have that sort of intellectual stimulation, but also
Mm-hmm.
begin to sort of lead them into a place of greater like receptivity to what their body might be saying. And
Hmm.
that seems to create like a safety of, hey, your mind can come with us. And of course, there is
Yeah.
a certain point on the journey where to really feel something, we're not simultaneously analyzing it. But, you know, it's hard. It's hard to change your way of perceiving
Yeah.
uh, and taking in information and sharing it with other people if it's so intellectual. And I know I tend to land in the thinking camp. And so part of this has been so helpful for me is rather than let's just get right in my feeling and bypass any kind of thinking mind stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
I guess as you were saying that, it makes me wonder if that has something to do with this tension between like the ideals and the next best step, or vulnerability of content, like me telling you a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
things, versus vulnerability of process, which is how am I experiencing this right now. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that has something to do with it. That maybe it appears like culturally we're much more heady than hearty.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, and this is a maybe a bit of a risk here, but I'm wondering something that as you've been speaking and something as we've been like connecting here today. Um, it's felt so different than last time, last episode when we were connecting like in a different way, and it's felt to me like I guess I just sometimes I become aware of like, I'm thinking a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
this is one of those moments. So what's kind of striking me right now is that it feels a little bit like this exact dynamic that you're talking about, that it can be really easy for us to kind of gravitate to the mind
Mm-hmm.
um, culturally. I wonder if it feels to you. It feels to me like this is kind of happening here a little bit,
Totally.
or
Yeah.
has been happening here throughout the episode. This episode has just felt a little bit different for me. It's felt I could feel kind of a distance interiorly for myself, or um, I could feel myself maybe kind of trying to say the right thing, or um, again, as we talked about a little bit last time, I found myself trying to say something valuable and then saying something and just feeling like it's an echo
Mm-hmm.
and kind of empty. And so maybe rather than go into the kind of intellectual side of that answer, like I wonder if we could go into the experience side and just I'm curious what your experience here, um, yeah, throughout our conversation has been.
Totally. It totally feels the same,
Yeah.
and I don't know why that is. It's um like I wonder if it's we were talking before the podcast about some things that I've been going through, and I know that when I
Yeah.
start to go through like stressors of any kind, I tend to one of one of my ways of dealing with that is thinking. And
Yeah, man.
so
Same.
um, usually it's a sign that I don't have as much access to my nervous system.
Yeah.
And like I know I'm thinking right now, but it's I usually suspect that it's uh, the nervous system is unavailable for for me, It
Yeah.
feels like it's somewhat unavailable, and it seems like that's, it's been a busy week. It's been a long week. Um, it's also been like a pretty emotionally draining week,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
um, a tendency that I have and I feel, and I wonder if other people who are listening feel this, is when it's draining and big and intense, the best way to connect is exactly that, right? It's to stay away. And I see it. I used to approach that with like a sense of shame. I
Wait,
used to
can you
like
say that again? That you because you just said the best way to connect is to stay away.
the best way to
What'd you mean
connect
there?
is to stay away from like immediate body sensation, or not body
Yeah.
sensations necessarily, but um,
Emotional
emotion.
experience.
Yeah, emotional
Yeah.
content.
And so best way as in like safest
Yeah, safest. Yeah, I think
or
that's a good
most
way to say it.
accessible.
Yeah, like what I have access to at this moment,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
something that I used to hold a lot of shame for. Like, for example, if you were to make that process comment, I think a couple years ago,
Yeah.
that would have made me feel like, oh no, I'm doing something that is counter to how humans connect.
Yeah.
Um, but like as I'm spending, like as I sit with your comment, it I'm filled with um, this is the product of a lot of like I would say self work,
Yeah.
self compassion. Is I'm filled with compassion for myself. Of
Mm.
there must be a lot going on to have to be
Yeah.
forced to be in the head, you know, to um, and I would just suspect that's such a relatable experience to
Yeah.
be,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. So sorry.
because it's so it takes so much to stay sensitive in our culture. I experience it that way. Like for me, it's a real value of mine to stay sensitive, and by sensitive I mean like I want to pick up what other people are feeling. I don't want to become desensitized to it.
Yes.
And to your point about like how do we do that from our Christian moral standards, it's I I just do it. I use my will to do it. But what I'm learning is that to have genuine sensitivity to the person in front of me requires a lot of self attunement, and that requires a lot of care. And I find it really challenging to maintain that in a 40-hour work week.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I'm reflecting on kind of how, as we're talking about process here, I'm reflecting on your question at the beginning. We were talking about process. We were talking about showing up, and you said like, yeah, JP, like how do you do that in your like daily life? Like, what does that look like for you? And I think it's the same place that where we started the conversation, where we are now, of like it's hard. Like it's hard to be available, and you talked about like that sensitivity. I think that's what I was kind of responding to and feeling, um, when you kind of were talking about the naturalness of attachment in a safe area. I was like, dude, it doesn't feel natural
mm-hmm.
or easy, like in the sense of like that sensitivity can be difficult. And i'm I'm
Yeah,
also so
it almost feels like another ideal, right? Like,
yeah.
like attachment is natural, and I think I've experienced that in moments, but it's not the rule. It's not the
Yeah.
rule.
Yeah, it's a nice relief when it is, but it certainly
Yeah.
isn't the rule. But I was really especially just the reason I made that comment was, honestly, well, first of all, I'm really glad the way really like what you said when you're like, yeah, you kind of said like, I realize like I have a lot of compassion myself, realizing like, wow, there's probably a lot going on for me.
And I don't know what it
What?
is.
And I don't know what it is. Like, what a
Yeah.
scary thing to say out loud, but also what a reverent thing. What a reverent way to turn inward, to just say like, oh, yeah, there's a lot here,
Yeah.
and I think one of the reasons that kind of prompted me to say that comment of kind of just shifting into the process and exploring what it's been like for you to be here with, and for me to be here, is because I just kind of started realizing like, oh, I kind of feel weird. Like I kind of feel I feel like a prop. Like, and
Yeah.
after I said it too, I was realizing like, dude, this whole time we've been talking, I just haven't really felt my body. Like, and it's not like I'm numb,
Yeah.
but in terms of my experience here, my body's felt invisible. And even as I say that, I can kind of, now I can feel my heart, right? I can feel like a little tension, a little pressure.
Yeah.
Um, and I think too, I don't know where I heard it, but there's this sense of like a universal cover up where there's this cultural rule, certainly in our culture, where we don't put to words the interaction that we're having. And you kind of said at one point today, it would be really sad if everybody was feeling like, I'd like to be more authentic, but I don't think I should. And so everybody's kind of in this, I want to be more of a real person, but I don't think I can be. And so what happens is a degradation of authenticity. And I think like I just do that all the time. And it's so scary to say like, hey, is this conversation, does this feel like we're kind of far away from ourselves, or does it
Mhm.
feel like something else is happening between us while we're up here in like our head? Does it feel like something else is happening between us? I'm also just really, really curious, as you said. I'm wondering, I'd love to hear comments, from people here today of like what this feels like. I wonder if other people notice that. I wonder if other people feel that. I think one of the things that happened last time we had a conversation here was you shared something with me. You kind of revealed something that you saw in myself, and you essentially said like, yeah, I can tell sometimes when this part of you is kind of giving a presentation. And you just named something that was here. You named something that you were experiencing in the interaction, and for me, it just felt like I felt interiorly like a big sigh of relief, just like,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
finally somebody else sees what I see, but they're seeing it in a way, they're not judging it or attacking it. They're just saying like, oh yeah, I see that too. Kind of like you said to yourself of like, oh yeah, I realize there's a lot there. And
Mhm.
it felt like it just gave a freedom to me to realize, to acknowledge that that's there. And I guess it felt like, man, finally somebody in the room is saying it. Like, almost like there's, in a meeting where maybe somebody's being a little bit rude or something, or I don't know, or bossy, and everybody's kind of just going along and like kind of pretending like it's not there, pretending like it's not happening, and then someone just kind of like stands up and is like, hey, I feel like there's a lot of negativity in this meeting, and it doesn't feel great, or like, what's happening here? It just, it breaks all of our internal rules. It breaks so many of our familial rules. It breaks so many of our cultural rules.
I felt that
And
sigh of
yet it's so
relief.
healing. Yeah.
I felt that sigh of relief.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's you're dead on. I mean, I don't like having to it I don't like having to put up a front, right? But it feels at times like an obligation. And I guess the way that and not I don't I want to speak to this. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to always do that. I think that's been like
I agree.
major growth edge for
Yeah.
me has been like it's okay to sometimes
Yeah.
let yourself put on a little bit of a front, right? We all
Yeah.
sometimes need that, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm sure that the grocery store cashier sometimes appreciates it when I'm just putting on an extra smile and just being as pleasant as I can be, right? Because our interaction's so short. Um, I don't want to. I used to be in the camp of let's just be honest all the time and be kind of raw all the time, and so I do think there's a place for like courtesy and
Yeah.
social tact, and I mean, like it's so obvious. Of course, there's a place for those things, but it's almost like when somebody says something, it what feels validating, or what just felt validating for me was, okay, everybody else is also kind of not in the mood, or doesn't have enough, or doesn't have enough in the tank left to
Yeah.
hold rank. Um, it's there's a time and there's a place, and it's so freeing. I find it so freeing to know that, like, not every, you were allowed to smile at people when you're feeling down, and that's
Yeah.
not necessarily inauthentic, right? And at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, doing that all the time could start turning into a total phony way of being.
Yeah. Yeah, man, two things are sticking out to me about one question, but also just like a reflection. You said, like, it's okay. We can kind of all say, like, hey, we're not there today. But, like, when that's said, I think the fear is that if I say, yeah, I'm feeling a little bit emotionally distant today because there's a lot going on internally, I think the fear is that we will be put on, like, the judgment block and to be like, what is it? Like, like, it will be scrutinized. Like, I think if we say, like, hey, yeah, I don't really want to open up, it'll be like, what's wrong? People, I think so many times people feel threatened by that. I think as a
Yeah,
therapist, that's why
gosh.
when people say, like, oh, I don't trust you, I welcome and invite them saying that, like, great, thanks for letting me know. Tell me a little bit about what it's like to be here with someone that you don't trust.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about the reasons that you might not trust me. I'm sure a lot of them are valid. So I think we don't
It's so
we don't experience
respectful.
that culture. Yeah, we don't experience that culture of respect, of like a boundary that says, like, I'm not ready. But also the other side of it is then all of a sudden people are like, oh no, and kind of try to escape to something else. Well, let's talk about the weather then.
Gosh, you know what it feels like as you're saying that is that it's like, oh no, am I responsible for that? That might be like the gut
Yeah,
reaction. I mean, I feel that sometimes if someone's like, I don't feel safe. Suddenly I'm like, are you okay?
yeah,
Did I do something? Did I mess up? Oh,
yeah. We
and
become
so
defensive.
what it requires though is a massive amount of tolerance for, okay, you're feeling anxious. I don't know if I caused it. I don't know if you just brought this to the table. I don't have to pry the reason out of you. I mean, it also does ask a lot of the other person. So it makes sense
Yeah,
why we wouldn't do it. It makes sense
and
why it would be like, am I going to get jumped on because of the uncertainty and anxiety of the other person? I know if I was in
yeah,
that shoes, it would require some, like, a deep breath and a
yeah,
remembrance of what's respectful. And it also has taken years of also being a therapist to practice that skill. For most of us, when we come out of our family of origin, we're not doing that. And so it does make sense, and I guess it gives me some compassion, but it also feels like to not do it is just to walk on eggshells with the person that, it's like it's to walk on eggshells in a place that sweeps everything under the rug. Like it's we've got to go through it. We've got to go through it, especially when the situation calls for it. Like I know you said in a work meeting, like I can imagine everybody's feeling it. Maybe there's a toxic environment. To speak up, that's very courageous, and it's going to have big effects. Um,
yeah,
so we have to go through it in these environments where we spend a lot of time. Our relationships, me and you, right? You and your
yeah.
wife. There's a sense in which, like, you've got to take that risk to go through all of the blowback. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it just requires a lot of awareness on behalf
Yeah.
of the person who is
Yeah.
gonna take that risk. Like you took the risk.
Yeah.
There's a chance I could
Yeah.
not take it well, I guess.
Yeah. I think that I think this talk what we're talking about here goes back a lot to safety and trust and responsibility. I trust, like here, I think taking that risk is based on the trust that I really trust that if you didn't want to do something or say something or talk about something, you'd say it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was struck when you said, yeah, it's so easy for us, say someone says, I don't trust you. It's so easy for us then to become threatened. And what happens then is we say, oh my gosh, what did I do? I'm sorry. And then all of a sudden there's a switch. And now the person that is feeling unsafe now becomes the caretaker of my emotional pain. And now it's like, no, John Paul, no, you're fine. You're a good therapist. You're a good friend. You're a good husband. You're a good X, Y, or Z. And the person who's in need because they're in an anxiety of unsureness of whether they can trust me or not, are now forced into a parental role to give me emotional reassurance because of my own insecurities.
What it seems like is when you make a process comment, you have to be willing to like expect that possibility, and you have to have the self-awareness to also be able to tolerate setting a boundary afterwards, which is I don't really
Yeah.
want to go into why I feel this way. I just felt like I couldn't really authentically participate in this conversation anymore unless I did say it. Right.
Yeah.
But like, you don't, something that is, I don't know, maybe it's useful for people to hear because it was sure useful for me to hear. Like, you don't owe people, if you share an emotion with somebody, you don't necessarily owe them the explanation to that emotional state.
Yes.
Right. Like, you don't have to
Yes.
define where it comes from, what was said. I know that it's helpful for the other person, for, especially if you're saying, hey, when you do X, I feel X. That can be really helpful. But you don't owe people an explanation of your
Yeah.
inner world if it doesn't
Yeah.
feel safe.
Yeah. I totally agree with that.
So it's complicated, right? It requires a lot of like back and forth and
Yeah.
I don't know if self-awareness is the right word. It probably just requires a lot of experiential learning, practice.
Well, I think it takes a lot of personal safety. Like, so for me, when someone says like I don't trust you, in especially in the therapeutic realm, what I see where I'm shifting it into is curiosity. And what I want to say is this goes back to kind of what we were talking about trust in the beginning is I want to say this is a relationship where you can tell me about your fears about me. Because what's a relationship if you can't? How much of a relationship do we have if as soon as you voice that you feel scared, you feel threatened, you feel nervous about how I might respond, my inability to tolerate that possibility of your feeling shifts me into a place of covering up and hiding it and actually invalidating it. And so when people say, oh, I don't really want to talk about it, I really try to welcome that and say like, great. What would happen if we talked about it? I try to say like, hey, I don't want to force you to talk about something or to not talk about something. This is actually your space. You can tell me as much as you want or as little as you want. But I'd love to reverence the fear that you're having right now about us talking about things. And I'd love to be sensitive in the future when these types of things come up. So could you just share a little bit of the context, just a little bit of an understanding for me of what would feel scary if you talked about this thing? And I think that's a way where we're not forcing someone to talk about something that they don't want to. We're not fleeing away because of anxiety. We are not forcing the person into an area of caregiving for us. We're just simply saying like, okay, cool. And this is where we grow in trust. Is when we can show up and be like, hey, I'm having a hard time trusting you. It's going to be either one of two things or both. Either it's going to be because people have perpetually let me down in the past. People that I should have been able to trust are going to have let me down in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So now I believe that people I should trust will probably let me down. Or two, it's going to be because you did something that was untrustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And if I did something that was untrustworthy for the person that I'm with, the number one thing that we should do is talk about that and sort it out. And I should take accountability for, my misstep. And so I love talking about this because it's something that I think I grew up. I think I developed this belief that trusting means that there's no fear about me and you in the relationship. Trusting means that like I'm not scared of bringing stuff to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that has not matched my experience in reality with the people who I trust the most, right? My wife, you, right? The people that are close to me. What I've experienced over and over again is I'm scared shitless, to be honest with them. But when I can say, hey, I'm really scared to share this with you because I'm afraid you might think I'm arrogant, or I'm afraid that you might think I'm shameful, or I'm afraid you might think I'm stupid. I have something that I want to share, but I'm just scared. All of a sudden, that whole interaction gets contextualized. And usually first of all, usually they respond in a way that's like, oh my gosh, I wouldn't want to do that to you. And then it's like, okay, this is a little bit safer. Or they respond in a way that's like, why would you think that? And I say, okay, not a safe person to share with. So I guess I think just the key here, and I know I've gotten really excited here because I think this is a place that I've experienced a lot of just healing in recent times. So I've really gotten really excited as we talk about this here. But it's something that never was taught to me or spelled out, and it's something that's like, dude, seems pretty important to understand. Like, what does trust mean in a relationship,
Mm-hmm. Well,
and what do we do when we're feeling mistrustful of somebody that's good? How do we approach that?
when you said it, I wonder who taught it to me, or nobody taught it to me. It made me wonder where
Yeah,
this comes from. And
yeah,
I think like it's probably to some degree, this has been evolving for thousands
yeah,
of years. And I think
yeah,
about like we see God as a father in the Christian
yeah,
tradition, and that evolved out of a different notion of God as, in the ancient world. Even I'm not even talking in uh, the Old Testament. I'm just talking about like in ancient
yeah,
Greece, the gods being angry gods that you needed to appease through sacrifice, and it seems like that also appeared in doses in the Old Testament with Abraham and Isaac. And I'm sure there's a
totally.
theologian out there who can probably explain how that fits into the New Testament better than I can. But like there's it seems like it's sort of a new, or not new, but consciousness has taken a while to evolve to this notion of seeing God as a safe, loving, unconditional parent, and who doesn't
Yes.
need sacrifice from us, or who doesn't need, like we need it. We
Yeah.
need struggle and sacrifice to grow, but we don't need it for His safety and love. Um, it makes me wonder, like, where does that come from?
Yeah.
If for me, it feels like the way I see God comes from my parenting that I received, and that can be undone slowly. I think through like a healthier model can be created through healthy relationships. But as you were saying, like it's good, it's good to do this, or this is such I guess you were insinuating kind of like this is a healthy way to exchange with people, which I agree. Maybe made me realize like there's also a time. It seems like there's a time and place for this too, and it's
Mm-hmm.
when we're relating to somebody who can, either temporarily or semi-permanently take on a role of secure base, maybe to say it in attachment terms.
Yeah.
But I guess like simple way to say it, as a parent, we relate
Yeah.
to them as a child to a parent, and that's such an important caveat because it just helps clarify so quickly who maybe we can't do that with or shouldn't do that with, or what situations aren't appropriate for it. It's like, you're getting something
Yeah.
done with somebody. You're not relating parent child. It's like we're two adults.
Yeah.
Of course, there's so much nuance here, but I guess it makes me, fleshing this out with you makes me reverence why we do it, and
Yeah.
why we abstain from vulnerability, and it gives me a greater like compassion and empathy for the reasons why we hide little parts of ourselves from other people, and why I do that. It makes it, like all things, I think that my broken record as a therapist is it makes sense. And yet again, when we get to closer to the bottom of this, it just feels like it makes sense.
It does. And we all make sense. Like that's some of the things that's the one thing that I've taken away from becoming a therapist that is perhaps the most overarching and profound, is like, we make sense. You make sense. I make sense.
Mm-hmm.
There are no crazy people. There are our behaviors, contradictory as they may be, paradoxical as they may be, we make sense. We're intelligible. We have a story. And when we think we don't make sense, it's because we don't understand our own story. And typically we don't understand our own story because we've been perpetually invalidated. And our emotions and our internal experience has been perpetually rejected. And that's the beauty of this personal journey, or the journey of therapy, is that when we come to know our own story, we come to understand that there's a reason that we do these things. There's this reason that there's this part of me that wants to present these things. There's this reason that there's parts of me that when I get angry want to shift into blame. And it's not just like, oh, because I'm a human. There's unique reasons in my experience. I think it goes, as you were talking about with God, there's a reason I see God as I do. Because for me, very much a lot of times my experience was, when push come to shove, it was like my dad would be like, well, you got to do this because I'm the dad. And it's like, well, I can't really argue with you because I'm a kid, even if I think I might be right about something. And so it's like, then I'm in this relationship with God and he says, follow the 10 commandments, whatever. I'm like, why? And what I experience is this projection of, because I'm God. And it's like, but that's not who he is, there's this notion, I think you mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, that like we have to become children to fully enter into adulthood. Like we have to be able to be children ourselves. It's one of the most beautiful things I've been learning with my son, Vincent, 7 years old. 7 years, not yet. 7 months old.
Where have I been?
Where have I been, man? Time goes so quick. But man, taking myself less seriously, slowing down, and man, I think I hear these same themes coming up over and over again, like kind of talking about emotions, talking about connection, talking about this balance between individuality and difference, talking about thought and feeling and bodily sensation. And we'll just we'll continue to let the dirty tap water flow, huh?
No, this is great. I think this is like a really great vulnerability of process with people who listen, to see us kind of like discover this in real time. And I think that like that's exciting. And just to kind of summarize, and I know you got to roll here in a second, but just to kind of summarize the experience I had of the session. I say that literally 5 times a day. How did you experience the session today? But how I experienced this conversation was like moving from a state of like you said, disconnected from yourself. I felt that to my posture hasn't changed, but a greater sitting back, like a greater sitting back into myself. And I think a takeaway too is an acknowledgement, like this is hard. This is hard, like you said. And also, it's very natural. Like, as soon as we started to open this floodgate, it just felt like,
Yeah.
oh, this is so nice.
This is so
And
much better. Like, oof.
the problem is that most of us, when we're really in our sensitive spots, just have like defense, 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 and it's like trapdoor, trapdoor. It's like, no, there's
Yeah.
another false floor. Oh my god! But what I feel as when I get to those moments where I don't know, me and my inner child, me and little Mikey, who's just a, a young boss. It's so easy, There, I guess that's an IFS thing that I experience, is that there is a part of me that is sort of undamaged. It's un it carries no pretense. It just is, and it was made to connect, and it's trusting, and that's why it needs these defenses, because it's not going to defend itself. That's how just direct and pure it is. So yeah, I experienced that with you today, and I think a very yeah, it feels like relieving. It just feels relieving
Yeah.
to go into that space and say, oh, okay, whew, this person's on the same page.
Yes.
They're open to that kind of dialogue. And I know we still could, probably a lot of people were like, they still were in their heads a lot. And I think that has something to do probably with personality type.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a difference. There's a difference of
Yeah.
authentic connection. It feels good.
Yeah, man, I've really learned this from you. There's such a power to just naming what's in the room.
Mm.
And it's scary and it's hard. And sometimes people don't like that. But if you can have a relationship and you can develop a culture where it is reverenced and it's welcomed to just name with care and compassion, but also courage to just name what's in the room. If you can have a relationship where you can just name what's in the room, dude, galaxies open up.
Mm.
And there's such a spring of connection. And I'm just grateful that we can do that here today.
Mm-hmm.
I really would be very curious. Thanks for anybody who's still listening here. Glad if you made it through the show. I'd be really curious and interested to hear your thoughts, reactions, and feelings as listeners going through this. If you were feeling that disconnection here in the conversation, and if you felt that shifting at all, that would be something I genuinely would be wildly interested to hear. So drop a comment below, like, subscribe, and this is the Dirty Tap Water.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you guys next time.